Hi green lovers! I've gotten so many questions about my Egyptian walking onions, how it gets its name, how it grows, how to propagate it, and so I thought I would make a video dedicated to the Egyptian walking onion. Let's talk about how the Egyptian walking onion or the top set onion got its name. The walking onion name comes from the fact that as this plant grows and produces a spike, instead of producing flowers, it produces what's called bulbils. And you can see the stalk is bending. Now this, when it touches the ground, the onion bulbils will put out roots and each of these will develop into new plants. So that's why they're called walking onions. I will be happy if this thing walks wherever it wants to walk because I love onions. I use it in all my cooking. Now let's talk about why it's called topset. For the obvious reason that it sets its onions on the top. It's also called a tree onion. Look how beautiful that is. You can see the bulbil right there. Each of these will develop into an onion. And what's really interesting is, let me show you this example, is this little bulbil clump is producing another stem. It's going to produce more bulbils on the top here. So it's like almost a never-ending chain, if you will. Eventually it just falls over. Wherever it touches the ground, it grows those new plants. I want to show you one more thing, and that's the weird way in which the flowers sometimes emerge. So you've got this stem, and initially it just looks like a green stem, and then suddenly you see this little flower thing, and it's almost like it grows slowly up the stalk, and then at a certain point it splits out of the stalk. Right here, this was the original stalk. It splits out and then it produces this bulbil stalk, and that's where the little bulbils grow. Very fascinating. I've never seen anything like this. Now let's talk a little bit more about how the Egyptian walking onion propagates. Now I've got two examples here. In this example, it propagates just like a scallion. In other words, you plant the bulb in the ground, a single bulb, and it divides. So out of one bulb, you get multiple plants. The second way is through these bulbils. Now each of these little bulbils is an Egyptian walking onion plant, and that is what I planted here. And you'll notice that it did not divide, which kind of makes sense because the first year it just wants to grow, produce those greens, produce those top bulbils. It hasn't quite yet developed that bulb at the bottom. Now the next year it will divide at the bottom as well because it would have built enough energy into the base, into the bulb, to do the dividing. But the first year all it's doing is growing and producing these top sets. Look at this massive top set. It's got bulbils and another flower that's coming up here that's going to be splitting off and producing more bulbils, and so on and so forth. And it has dropped. You see it's bent here. It has dropped, and once this stem starts to dry out, you've got to get pretty quick about breaking off these bulbils and planting them, because once this energy source from the mother plant stops feeding the bulbils, they will die if they're not already touching soil. So you got to keep an eye out for that if you want to actively propagate or eat your Egyptian walking onions. I want to show you how this bulbil is trying really hard to propagate right here. You can see the stem has extended here into the neighboring pot. It found this neighboring pot and it has dropped plants here. I don't know whether they've started producing roots. I don't think they have. They look like they're barely touching the soil. But if I keep this moist, if I keep the soil well watered, it's going to produce completely new plants. And before you ask, no, Egyptian walking onions are not propagated from seeds. The only way you can propagate them is through these bulbils or through planting the bulbs at the roots and having them divide. Here's another interesting thing that the Egyptian walking onion does. Look at this long branch. Gosh, it's got to be over 2 feet long, and that's just from this point. The top set has produced another top set. And what it's doing is it's trying to find some soil to root. So it's growing and growing downward in search of soil. On the other hand, these branches that reached over and found soil, they stopped growing, and instead now they're putting up onions growing upward, versus this one, the little onions that would have grown upward, they're actually dying. See how it's drying out there? And the main reason is, I think, because it's putting all the energy into the branch that's growing downward. So these little things don't want to take up any energy. They want to send all the energy to that branch that is trying to survive. Versus over here, they feel that they've arrived already, so they're producing their upshoots. Just fascinating how nature works. Now, this is my very first year growing Egyptian walking onions. I planted these round about, I'd say about August of last year. It's the month of May right now, and it has tripled. The number of plants has tripled, maybe even more by now from the time I bought them or planted them, and they've produced all these new potential plants as well. So it just grows exponentially year after year is what I would imagine. Now, I don't know what this is doing here. This is another interesting version of the top set. I am not sure whether it's producing seeds or what it's doing, but I'm going to be interested to watch to see what this little thing is doing here. Yet another variation. And I'll keep you informed. If you subscribe to my channel, I'll keep you informed on the progress of this wonderful plant. And finally, how do you eat this? Well, you can eat the leaves just like you would any regular onion, green onion. It's delicious, very, very productive. And of course, the bulbils can be used as little onions in place of little onions. And the bulbs, once you start to get too many of these, you can actually start pulling up the bulbs and eating them like regular onions. Now, they won't be as large as the ones that you get at the grocery store, but they still taste exactly like onions and can be used in any dish that calls for onions. So I'm hoping that at some point I will never need to buy onions anymore, because this will be supplying all my needs, unless I want to get those big onions for some particular recipe, maybe large onion rings or something like that. But other than that, this is all I'm going to need to satisfy all my onion needs. You may also want to know where you can get your hands on some bulbs or bulbils, because these things don't grow from seeds. I got mine on Amazon. I've seen them on Etsy as well. I think some seed companies do sell them too. They typically sell them in the fall, and that's probably the best time to plant as well, because the plants have got some time to establish a good solid root system over the winter, and then in spring they're just going to explode in growth. That's what I did, at least. I planted them in fall last year, and look at them. They're just taking off. And the other thing that you can do is maybe throw a request out on your Nextdoor app or your neighborhood Facebook page. There may be some friendly neighbors that would like to share some bulbs with you. I know I would love to share with friends as soon as I've got enough to share. So I'm sure there'll be someone out there that might be able to spare a few bulbils for you. Anyway, I hope you get your hands on Egyptian walking onions. They're just so fun to grow. And I hope you liked this video, and if you did, if you could be so kind as to hit that like button, it really does help the video get out to a broader audience. And yeah, until next time, live green and love your greens.